Billionaire stopped his car in shock when he saw his ex-wife in the rain holding their baby girl. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The rain hammered against the windshield of Leonard Huxley's black Bentley Continental as he navigated through the congested streets of Manhattan. His fingers drummed impatiently on the leather steering wheel, his sharp jawline tense with the familiar weight of another 16-hour workday. At 38, Leonard had built an empire in the financial sector through relentless focus and calculated decisions. His steel-gray eyes, which had intimidated countless business rivals, now stared ahead at the blurred city lights through the rain-streaked glass. Leonard was a man who commanded attention wherever he went. Standing at 6'3" with broad shoulders that filled his tailored Italian suits perfectly, he possessed the kind of presence that could silence a boardroom with a single glance. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, never a strand out of place, and his clean-shaven face carried the confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything he set his mind to. Tonight, however, something felt different. A restlessness gnawed at him, though he couldn't quite place its source. The traffic light ahead turned red, forcing him to stop. Leonard reached for his phone, already mentally preparing for the emails that would demand his attention even at this late hour. The rain continued its relentless assault on the city, creating a curtain of water that seemed to wash away the day's troubles for everyone except him. That's when he saw her. Through the passenger window, across the intersection, stood a figure that made his heart stop. Ivy Huxley, though she'd probably gone back to Collins by now, was standing under a broken streetlight with inadequate shelter. Her once golden hair, now darker from the rain, clung to her face as she held something precious against her chest, trying desperately to shield it from the downpour. Leonard's breath caught in his throat. In Ivy's arms was a small child, a little girl with dark hair and curious eyes that sparkled even in the dim light. Lila, their daughter. His daughter, though he'd never truly claimed that title. The woman who had once shared his bed, his home, his name looked nothing like the polished socialite she'd been during their marriage. Ivy's clothes, a thin coat that offered little protection from the elements and worn jeans, spoke of struggles he'd never bothered to consider. Her face, still beautiful despite the exhaustion etched in her features, carried a strength he'd forgotten she possessed. Lila, now 14 months old, was laughing despite the rain, her tiny hands reaching up to catch the droplets. The sound of that innocent laughter pierced through the car's soundproofing and straight into Leonard's chest, creating an ache he hadn't felt since the day he'd signed the divorce papers. Leonard had always prided himself on his control, his ability to compartmentalize every aspect of his life. But seeing Ivy struggling to protect their daughter while he sat in his heated luxury car felt like a punch to his perfectly maintained facade. This was the child he'd known about but chose to ignore. The pregnancy he'd dismissed as poor timing. The birth he'd missed because of a crucial business meeting that probably hadn't mattered at all. Without thinking, Leonard pulled over to the curb, his hands shaking slightly as he turned off the engine. The rain soaked through his expensive suit the moment he stepped out of the car, but he barely noticed. His Italian leather shoes splashed through puddles as he crossed the street, his heart pounding with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. "Ivy?" His voice came out rougher than intended. She turned, her green eyes widening in surprise before quickly hardening with a mixture of hurt and defiance. Lila looked at him with innocent curiosity, her tiny hand gripping her mother's wet coat. "Leonard." Ivy's voice was steady, but he could hear the underlying tension. "What are you doing here?" He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain that seeing them like this, vulnerable, struggling, beautiful in their resilience, had shattered something inside him that he'd kept carefully locked away? "I saw you," he finally managed, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I couldn't just drive by." Ivy shifted Lila to her other hip, the movement protective and instinctive. "Now you see us? After more than a year of pretending we don't exist?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow because it was true. He had pretended. He'd convinced himself that walking away was the responsible thing to do, that a man like him, driven, ambitious, emotionally unavailable, had no business trying to be a father. Lila began to fuss, reaching her small arms toward the warm glow of a nearby cafe. Ivy glanced at Leonard, then at their daughter, seeming to weigh her options. "She's beautiful," Leonard whispered, his eyes fixed on the child who carried his dark hair and Ivy's delicate features. "She's cold and wet, and we need to get inside," Ivy replied curtly, but he caught the slight tremor in her voice. Leonard looked around, realizing for the first time that they were standing in front of a small laundromat, its fluorescent lights flickering weakly. The contrast between this moment and the life he'd built for himself was stark and humbling. "Let me help," he said, reaching into his wallet. "We don't need your money, Leonard." Ivy's interruption was sharp, her pride intact despite her circumstances. "We never did. What we needed was you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of lost time and missed opportunities. Leonard watched as Ivy adjusted her grip on Lila, preparing to walk away from him again. But this time, something inside him refused to let her go. Would you have had the courage to face the family you abandoned, or would you have driven away? Leonard's expensive Italian shoes squeaked against the linoleum floor of the small cafe as he followed Ivy inside, water dripping from his tailored suit onto the worn tiles. The warm air hit them immediately, carrying the comforting sense of coffee and fresh pastries. Ivy had finally agreed to let him buy them shelter from the rain, though her acceptance had come with obvious reluctance. The cafe was nearly empty at this hour, save for an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner and a college student typing frantically on her laptop. Leonard felt completely out of place in his designer suit among the mismatched chairs and chipped tables, but for the first time in months, he didn't care about appearances. Ivy settled into a booth near the window, carefully arranging Lila on her lap. The little girl's eyes were wide as she took in her new surroundings, her small hands reaching toward the warm light fixtures above. When her gaze landed on Leonard, she tilted her head with the innocent curiosity that only toddlers possessed. "Mama," Lila babbled, pointing a tiny finger at Leonard. Leonard's chest tightened. The word hit him harder than any business rejection ever had. He was a stranger to his own daughter, nothing more than an interesting curiosity in her young world. Ivy ordered a hot chocolate for herself and a small cup of warm milk for Lila, while Leonard mechanically asked for black coffee, though his hands were shaking too much to trust himself with anything hot. He watched as Ivy gently cleaned Lila's face with a napkin, her movements practiced and tender. This was a routine they'd developed without him, hundreds of small moments of care and love that he'd missed entirely. "She's walking now," Ivy said quietly, not looking at him directly. "Started 3 weeks ago. She loves music, especially that lullaby from the old Disney movies. And she's stubborn. Gets that from both of us, I suppose." Leonard hung on to every word, desperate to learn about the person his daughter was becoming. "What's her favorite food?" "Strawberries. And those little cheese crackers shaped like goldfish." Ivy's voice softened as she spoke about Lila. "She also has this stuffed elephant named Button that she can't sleep without." As if summoned by the mention of her beloved toy, Lila began looking around the cafe with increasing distress. "Button? Button?" she called, her voice rising with panic. "Oh, sweetheart, Button is at home, remember? We'll see him soon," Ivy soothed, pulling Lila closer. But Lila's lower lip began to tremble, and soon tears were flowing down her chubby cheeks. Leonard watched helplessly as Ivy tried various distractions, making funny faces, offering her milk, even pulling up videos on her phone. Nothing worked. Without thinking, Leonard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his fountain pen, a sleek Mont Blanc that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. He clicked it open and closed repeatedly, creating a soft rhythmic sound that immediately caught Lila's attention. "Look at this," he said softly, holding the pen up so the cafe's lights caught its silver surface. "See how it shines?" Lila's crying slowed to sniffles as she watched the pen move in Leonard's hands. He continued clicking it gently, creating patterns of sound that seemed to fascinate her. Gradually she leaned forward in Ivy's lap, stretching her small hand toward the shiny object. Leonard glanced at Ivy, who nodded slightly. Carefully, he placed the pen on the table within Lila's reach, but far enough away that she'd have to stretch for it. The little girl giggled and grabbed for it with both hands, immediately bringing it to her mouth. "No, no, baby," Ivy said gently, redirecting Lila's attention to the safe end of the pen. "We don't eat daddies." She stopped abruptly, her face flushing as she realized what she'd almost said. The word hung in the air between them. Daddy. Leonard felt something crack open in his chest, a raw vulnerability he'd spent years learning to suppress. "It's okay," he said quietly. "She should know who I am, even if I haven't earned the title." Ivy looked at him then, really looked at him, and Leonard saw something shift in her expression. Not forgiveness, it was far too early for that, but perhaps the beginning of recognition that the man sitting across from her was different from the one who had walked away. Lila, delighted with her new toy, began babbling happily as she waved the pen around. Leonard found himself genuinely smiling for the first time in months, watching his daughter's pure joy over something so simple. "She likes you," Ivy observed, though her tone remained guarded. "I don't deserve that," Leonard replied honestly, "but I'm grateful for it." The cafe's atmosphere wrapped around them like a cocoon, creating a temporary sanctuary from the rain and the complicated history between them. Leonard studied Ivy's profile as she watched Lila play, noting the new lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and solo parenting. The woman who had once planned charity galas and managed his social calendar was now navigating motherhood alone, and she was magnificent at it. "Ivy," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I need you to know." "Don't." She held up a hand, her eyes still fixed on Lila. "Not tonight. Tonight, let's just let her get used to you being here." Leonard nodded, understanding that this fragile moment was more than he deserved. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside this small cafe, something was beginning to shift between them. As if sensing the importance of the moment, Lila suddenly looked up at Leonard and offered him her biggest smile, the pen still clutched in her tiny fist. For the first time in over a year, Leonard felt like he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. 3 days had passed since the rainy encounter at the cafe, and Leonard found himself doing something he'd never done before, sitting in his corner office staring at his phone instead of his computer screens. The financial markets were in their usual state of controlled chaos. His assistant had left 6 messages about urgent meetings, and yet all he could think about was the sound of Lila's laughter and the way Ivy had almost called him Daddy. His office, perched on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, offered a commanding view of Central Park. The floor-to-ceiling windows usually made him feel powerful, in control of his domain. Today they only reminded him of how far removed he was from the life happening on the streets below. Leonard picked up his phone for the dozenth time, scrolling to Ivy's contact information. He'd never deleted it, though he'd convinced himself it was merely an oversight. His thumb hovered over the call button before he set the phone down again, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Huxley, you have the Meridian Industries meeting in 5 minutes, came his assistant's voice. "Cancel it," Leonard said without hesitation. "Sir, this is the acquisition you've been working on for 8 months. Leonard looked at his reflection in the darkened computer screen. The man staring back at him looked successful, polished, and completely hollow. "Cancel all my meetings for the rest of the day, Patricia. Something more important has come up." 20 minutes later, Leonard stood outside a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, his heart pounding harder than it had during his first billion-dollar deal. The building was well-maintained but clearly older, with small front gardens, and the kind of character that his sterile Manhattan penthouse lacked entirely. He'd found Ivy's address through methods he wasn't proud of, a private investigator he'd hired months ago, and never had the courage to contact until now. Standing here felt like crossing a line he could never uncross. Before he could lose his nerve, Leonard climbed the steps and knocked on the door marked 2B. The sound of footsteps approached, followed by Ivy's voice calling, "Just a minute." When the door opened, Ivy's surprised expression quickly shifted to wariness. She was wearing jeans and a soft cream-colored sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow made her look more beautiful than any of the elaborate styles she'd worn during their marriage. "Leonard, how did you—" "I hired someone to find you," he admitted, knowing that starting with honesty was his only chance. "I know how that sounds, but I needed to see her again. To see you both." Ivy's jaw tightened. "You can't just show up here unannounced. This is my home, my safe space." "You're right. I should have called first. I should have done a lot of things differently." Leonard shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how his expensive suit made him stand out in this neighborhood, like a peacock among sparrows. "Is she here?" As if in answer to his question, the sound of children's music drifted from inside the apartment, followed by Lila's delighted squealing. Ivy glanced back toward the sound, her expression softening despite her anger. "She's having lunch," Ivy said. "And before you ask, no, you can't come in, not like this, not without warning." Leonard nodded, accepting the boundary even though it stung. "Then let me ask you something else. When can I see her again? Properly this time, when you feel comfortable with it." Ivy studied his face for a long moment as if trying to read his intentions. "Why now, Leonard?" You had 16 months to care about her existence. What changed? The question hit him like a physical blow because it forced him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. Seeing you both in the rain, it broke something in me that I didn't even know was broken. I spent so long convincing myself that I wasn't father material, that I'd only mess her up the way my father messed me up. Your father? Ivy's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing some of the hostility. Leonard rarely spoke about his childhood, even during their marriage. He was never around, always working, always building the empire that I eventually inherited. When he was home, he was critical, distant. I told myself I was protecting Lila by staying away, but really, I was just protecting myself. From inside the apartment, Lila's voice called out, "Mama, Mama," followed by the sound of small feet running across hardwood floors. Ivy glanced back again, torn between her maternal instincts and her need to protect her daughter from further disappointment. "She's been asking about the man with the shiny pen. I told her you were a friend of Mommy's." The word friend shouldn't have hurt as much as it did, but Leonard understood he had no right to claim anything more. "What would it take for you to trust me enough to let me try? I'm not asking for custody or overnight visits. I just want the chance to be present for her in a way I never was before." Lila appeared in the doorway then, peeking around Ivy's legs with curious eyes. She was wearing a yellow dress covered in tiny daisies, and her dark hair was held back with small butterfly clips. When she saw Leonard, her face broke into a huge smile. "Pen Man?" she exclaimed, clapping her hands together. Leonard's throat tightened with emotion. "Hello, Lila." The little girl looked up at Ivy, then back at Leonard, as if sensing the tension between the adults, but not understanding its source. She held up a small stuffed elephant. The famous Button, Leonard realized. "Button," she announced proudly, making the elephant wave at Leonard. "It's very nice to meet you, Button," Leonard said seriously, which made Lila giggle. Ivy watched this interaction with conflicted emotions playing across her face. Finally, she sighed. "There's a playground 6 blocks from here, Riverside Park. Saturday mornings. We go there for an hour around 10. If you want to see her, you can meet us there. But I set the rules, Leonard. Any sign that this is just some guilty phase you're going through and you're out of our lives for good?" Leonard nodded eagerly, relief flooding through him. "Saturday at 10. I'll be there." As he turned to leave, Lila called out, "Bye-bye, Penman." Leonard looked back to see her waving enthusiastically, Button still clutched in her other hand. The image burned itself into his memory. His daughter, happy and carefree, completely unaware of the complicated adult emotions swirling around her. Walking back to his car, Leonard realized he'd just agreed to something that terrified him more than any business negotiation ever had. The chance to be a real father, with all the vulnerability and potential for failure that entailed. Saturday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and golden sunlight filtering through the trees of Riverside Park. Leonard had been awake since 5 a.m., changing his outfit 3 times before settling on dark jeans and a navy cashmere sweater, an attempt to look approachable rather than intimidating. He'd never been nervous about a meeting in his life, but standing at the park entrance at 9:45 a.m. he felt like a teenager on his first date. The playground was already bustling with families. Leonard watched fathers pushing their children on swings, mothers chatting while their toddlers played in the sandbox, and couples sharing coffee on nearby benches. He'd never paid attention to this world before, the casual intimacy of weekend family life, and now he felt like an outsider looking in. "You're early." Leonard turned to find Ivy approaching with Lila in a small stroller, a diaper bag slung over her shoulder. His daughter was wearing pink overalls and tiny white sneakers, her hair in 2 small pigtails that bounced as she looked around excitedly. Button the elephant was secured safely in her lap. "I didn't want to be late," Leonard admitted, his hands awkwardly shoved in his pockets. Ivy studied his outfit choice with barely concealed amusement. "You look different. Is that good or bad?" "Different," she repeated, unbuckling Lila from the stroller. "We'll see." The moment Lila was free, she toddled directly toward the jungle gym, her small legs carrying her with determined purpose toward a tunnel slide. Leonard instinctively moved to follow her, but Ivy caught his arm. "She's fine. She knows this playground like the back of her hand." Ivy's touch was brief but sent an unexpected jolt through Leonard's system. The hard part isn't watching her play. It's learning to let her explore while staying close enough to catch her if she falls. Leonard nodded, filing away this piece of parenting wisdom. They found a bench with a clear view of the play area, and he watched in fascination as Lila immediately made friends with another toddler, a little boy with curly red hair who was building something elaborate in the sandbox. She's social, Leonard observed. Very. Sometimes I think she gets lonely being an only child. Ivy's voice carried a wistfulness that made Leonard's chest tighten with guilt. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Lila navigate the small climbing structure with impressive determination. She called out, "Mama, look," every few seconds, waving enthusiastically before attempting another challenge. "I brought something," Leonard said suddenly, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. Ivy's expression immediately became guarded. "Leonard, I told you this wasn't about gifts." "It's not expensive," he interrupted. "Just something I thought you might like." The package contained a small board book titled Ellie's First Words, featuring a friendly cartoon elephant on the cover. Leonard had spent an embarrassing amount of time in the children's section of Barnes & Noble the night before, eventually choosing this book because it reminded him of Button. Ivy examined the book, her expression softening. "This is thoughtful. She loves being read to. Could I read it to her?" Before Ivy could answer, Lila came running over, breathing hard from her playground adventures. She climbed onto the bench between them, automatically leaning against Ivy while eyeing Leonard with curious but friendly interest. "What's that?" Lila asked, pointing at the book in Leonard's hands. "It's a story about an elephant, like Button," Leonard explained, his voice gentler than Ivy had ever heard it. "Would you like me to read it to you?" Lila nodded enthusiastically, scooting slightly closer to Leonard. He opened the book carefully, acutely aware that this was the first time he'd ever read to his daughter, or any child for that matter. "Once upon a time there was a little elephant named Ellie who loved to learn new words," Leonard began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a practiced storyteller, though his hands trembled slightly. Lila was immediately captivated, pointing at the colorful illustrations and repeating the simple words as Leonard read them. When they reached a page showing Ellie playing with her family, Lila looked up at Leonard with wide eyes. "Daddy Elephant," she said matter-of-factly, pointing at the male elephant in the picture. Leonard's breath caught. Ivy tensed beside him, clearly unsure how to handle the moment. "That's right," Leonard managed, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the daddy elephant." Lila seemed satisfied with this answer and turned her attention back to the book. They finished the story together, with Lila helping by turning the pages and making elephant sounds at appropriate moments. When they finished, Lila slid off the bench and headed back toward the playground, clutching the book against her chest alongside Button. Leonard watched her go, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of the moment. "She likes you," Ivy said quietly. "I like her too, more than I ever imagined possible." "Leonard," Ivy's voice carried a warning tone, "don't make promises you can't keep. She's already been through enough change in her short life." Leonard turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious and determined. "I'm not going anywhere, Ivy. I know I have no right to ask you to believe that based on my track record, but I need you to know that everything is different now." "What's different?" "Your priorities, your work schedule, your complete inability to put anyone's needs before your own." The accusations stung because they were fair, but Leonard had spent the past week asking himself the same questions. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how we needed me, not my money. I think I finally understand what that means." Before Ivy could respond, Lila's voice called out from the jungle gym. "Mama, Penman, watch me." They both turned to see her at the top of a small slide, waving proudly before pushing off and sliding down with gleeful laughter. Without thinking, both Leonard and Ivy stood up and applauded, their shared pride in her accomplishment momentarily bridging the gap between them. "She called me Penman again," Leonard said with a slight smile. "She remembers people through details. The pen was important to her." Ivy paused, then added more softly, "Maybe someday she'll have a different name for you." The hope in those words was cautious but real, and Leonard felt something shift in his chest. For the first time since he'd signed those divorce papers, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could earn his way back into their lives. As they watched Lila make friends with every child on the playground, Leonard realized that being a father wasn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was about showing up, paying attention and being present for all the small moments that added up to a life together. 2 weeks had passed since the playground meeting, and Leonard found himself living for the small text updates Ivy would send. Photos of Lila reading the elephant book, videos of her saying new words, snapshots of her daily adventures. He'd started leaving work at reasonable hours, something his assistant Patricia had noted with barely concealed shock. It was Tuesday evening when Leonard's phone rang as he sat in his penthouse, reviewing acquisition documents that suddenly seemed far less important than they once had. The caller ID showed Ivy's name, and his heart immediately jumped. She never called unless something was wrong. "Ivy? Is everything okay?" "Leonard, Her voice was strained, exhausted. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I don't know who else to call. Lila's been sick for 2 days with a high fever, and it's not breaking. I'm at Mount Sinai emergency room and they're running tests, but—" Her voice cracked slightly. "I'm scared." Leonard was already reaching for his keys before she finished speaking. "I'm on my way." "Which entrance?" "You don't have to—" "Ivy, stop, I'm coming. Text me the room number." 20 minutes later, Leonard burst through the emergency room doors, his expensive suit wrinkled from his frantic rush across the city. He found them in room 314, Ivy pacing by the window while Lila lay listlessly on the small hospital bed, looking impossibly tiny against the white sheets. The sight of his daughter so still and pale hit Leonard like a physical blow. Lila's usual bright energy was completely absent, replaced by the frightening quietness of a very sick child. Button lay beside her, and her new elephant book was open on the bedside table, as if Ivy had been trying to comfort her with familiar things. "How long has she been like this?" Leonard asked softly, moving to stand beside Ivy. "Since Sunday night. At first I thought it was just a cold, but then her temperature spiked to 103 and she stopped eating." Ivy's voice was raw with exhaustion and worry. "The doctors are checking for everything. Ear infection, strep throat, even meningitis." Leonard felt his stomach drop at the word meningitis, but he forced himself to stay calm for Ivy's sake. "Have you eaten anything? Slept at all?" Ivy shook her head, her attention never leaving Lila. "I can't. Not while she's like this." Without saying another word, Leonard pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Within minutes, a nurse appeared with coffee, sandwiches, and a comfortable chair that Leonard had somehow arranged to have brought up from the family waiting area. "You need to take care of yourself too," he said gently, guiding Ivy to the chair. "She needs you strong." For the first time since he'd arrived, Ivy looked directly at him. Her green eyes were rimmed with red from worry and lack of sleep, but there was something else there. Gratitude, and perhaps surprise at his take-charge attitude. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "I know I said I could handle things alone, but seeing her like this—" "You're not alone," Leonard said firmly. "Not anymore." They settled into a vigil beside Lila's bed. Leonard found himself studying every detail of his daughter's face, the way her dark eyelashes fanned against her pale cheeks, the small freckle near her left ear, the way she clutched Button even in sleep. This was the longest he'd ever spent simply watching her, and the circumstances made it both precious and terrifying. Around midnight, Dr. Sarah Martinez, a kind-faced pediatrician with graying hair, entered the room with test results. Leonard and Ivy both stood immediately, their shared anxiety palpable. "The good news is we've ruled out meningitis and anything seriously dangerous," Dr. Martinez began, and Leonard felt Ivy sag with relief beside him. "She has a severe ear infection that's been resistant to the antibiotics you were giving her at home. We're going to start her on a stronger IV antibiotic tonight." "How long until she's better?" Ivy asked. "She should start improving within 24 hours of the new medication, but I want to keep her overnight for observation, just to make sure the fever breaks properly." After the doctor left, Ivy sank back into the chair, the adrenaline of the past few days finally catching up with her. Leonard watched her shoulders shake with silent tears of relief and exhaustion. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside her chair. "She's going to be okay." "I was so scared," Ivy admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they mentioned meningitis, I kept thinking about all the things I'd never taught her, all the experiences she might never have, and I realized that even though I'm angry at you, even though I don't trust you completely yet, I wanted her to know her father. I wanted you to have the chance to love her the way she deserves." Leonard felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. This woman, who had every right to hate him, was still thinking about his relationship with their daughter even in her darkest moment of fear. "I do love her," he said quietly. "I think I loved her from the moment I saw her in your arms that night in the rain. I was just too scared and too selfish to admit it." Around 2 a.m., Lila's fever finally began to break. She stirred in her sleep, opening her eyes slowly. When she saw Leonard sitting beside her bed, she gave him a weak but genuine smile. "Pen man," she whispered, her voice hoarse but glad. "Hi, sweetheart," Leonard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "How are you feeling?" Instead of answering, Lila reached out her small hand toward him. Leonard looked at Ivy, who nodded encouragingly. When he took his daughter's tiny fingers in his much larger hand, she squeezed with surprising strength. "Button," Lila said, pointing to her elephant. "Button's right here, keeping you company," Leonard assured her. "And so are we. Mama and I aren't going anywhere." Lila seemed satisfied with this answer and drifted back to sleep, but she didn't let go of Leonard's hand. For the rest of the night, he sat in that uncomfortable hospital chair, his fingers intertwined with his daughter's, finally understanding what it truly meant to be needed. 3 weeks after the hospital scare, Leonard had established a routine that would have been unthinkable to him just months before. Every Tuesday and Saturday he spent time with Lila and Ivy, and he'd started working from home on Fridays just to be more available. His penthouse office had been transformed with the addition of a small children's corner, colorful books, safe toys, and a tiny chair where Lila could sit when she visited. It was on a crisp November afternoon when Leonard's carefully constructed new world came crashing down with a single phone call. He was reading to Lila in his office, her small body curled against his side as they worked through her favorite elephant book for what had to be the 100th time, when his private line rang. Only 3 people had that number: his assistant, his lawyer, and his father. Leonard glanced at the caller ID and felt his blood run cold. Richard Huxley, a man who hadn't bothered to call his son in over 2 years, and who had never once asked about his granddaughter. "Keep reading, sweetheart," Leonard murmured to Lila, but his voice had already changed, becoming tighter and more controlled. "Leonard," Richard's voice was as commanding as ever, despite his 78 years. "We need to talk." "I'm busy right now, Dad. Cancel whatever trivial matter is occupying your time. I'm in Manhattan, and I'm coming up." The line went dead, and Leonard stared at his phone in disbelief. His father hadn't set foot in his penthouse since Leonard had bought it 5 years ago, claiming it was too modern and lacking in proper gravitas. "Who was that?" Lila asked, her small hand patting the book to get his attention back. "Just someone from work," Leonard lied, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected invasion. 20 minutes later, the private elevator opened directly into Leonard's penthouse, and Richard Huxley emerged like a storm cloud in an expensive suit. Even at nearly 80, he commanded attention. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that had built the Huxley financial empire from nothing. His pale blue eyes, so similar to Leonard's but harder, immediately swept the room and landed on the colorful children's corner with obvious disdain. "What?" Richard said in a voice that could freeze fire. "Is that monstrosity doing in your office?" Leonard instinctively moved protectively in front of Lila, who had gone very quiet behind him. "Hello to you too, Dad. It's been what? 2 years since you last—" "Don't be flippant with me, Leonard. I've been hearing disturbing reports about your recent behavior. Missing crucial meetings, turning down profitable deals, and now I arrive to find evidence that you're playing house with some child. That child is your granddaughter," Leonard said, his voice dangerously low. Richard's expression didn't change. "A child you rightfully walked away from. A child who represents nothing but a liability to this family's legacy." Leonard felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm for Lila's sake. "Her name is Lila, and she's not a liability. She's my daughter. She's a mistake," Richard corrected coldly, "and I won't stand by and watch you destroy everything I've built because you've developed some misguided attachment to a woman who was clearly after your money and the child she used to trap you. That's enough." Leonard's control finally snapped. "You will not speak about Ivy that way, and you will not speak about Lila that way. They are my family." "Family?" Richard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Leonard, you have responsibilities. The Meridian acquisition you've been neglecting could be worth $12 billion. The Shanghai expansion needs your full attention. You don't have time for this domestic fantasy." During this heated exchange, neither man noticed Lila quietly slide off Leonard's chair and toddle toward Richard, with the innocent curiosity of a toddler who doesn't understand adult anger. "Hi," she said brightly, looking up at Richard with Leonard's same gray eyes. Richard looked down at her with the same expression he might use to examine an unpleasant business rival. "Leonard, remove this child from my sight immediately." But Lila, oblivious to the tension, held up her elephant book. "Want to read about Ellie?" "I do not read children's books," Richard said dismissively, "and I suggest you learn to occupy yourself with more worthwhile pursuits." Leonard watched his daughter's face fall at the harsh rejection, and something inside him broke completely. This was exactly what his own childhood had been like: cold, critical, loveless. He'd sworn he would never put a child through that. And yet here was his father, treating Lila with the same emotional cruelty Leonard remembered so well. "Get out," Leonard said quietly. "Excuse me?" "I said get out." Leonard's voice was getting stronger, more certain. "You are not welcome here, and you are never to speak to my daughter that way again." Richard's face flushed with anger. "Leonard, think carefully about what you're saying. You are my heir, my successor, but that position comes with expectations and sacrifices. If you can't handle both your responsibilities and this distraction, then perhaps it's time to consider other arrangements." The threat was clear: choose the family business and fortune, or choose Ivy and Lila. Leonard looked down at his daughter, who was clutching her book and looking confused by the adult anger swirling around her. "Penman sad?" Lila asked, reaching up to touch Leonard's hand. And in that moment, Leonard realized that his choice had already been made weeks ago in a hospital room when he'd held his daughter's hand through the night. "No, sweetheart," Leonard said softly, picking Lila up and holding her close. "Penman isn't sad anymore." He looked directly at his father. "I choose them. I choose my family. And if that means losing your approval and your money, then so be it." Richard's face went white with fury. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Leonard. That woman and child will ruin you just like your mother ruined me with her emotional weakness." "Mom didn't ruin you," Leonard replied calmly. "You ruined yourself by choosing money over love, power over family. I won't make the same mistake." After his father left, Leonard held Lila close as she played with his tie, completely unaware that she'd just witnessed her father choose love over everything else he'd ever known. When Ivy arrived to pick up Lila an hour later, she immediately sensed something had changed. "What happened?" she asked, studying Leonard's face. Leonard looked at his daughter, then at the woman he'd once been married to, and realized that for the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he was supposed to be. The consequences of Leonard's confrontation with his father came swiftly and brutally. Within 48 hours, Leonard found himself locked out of his own company's systems, his corporate credit cards canceled, and his position as CEO suspended, pending a board review of his mental fitness to lead. Leonard sat in his penthouse office, staring at the termination notice that had been hand-delivered that morning. The irony wasn't lost on him. The children's corner he'd created for Lila was now the brightest spot in a room that had suddenly become a monument to his professional downfall. His phone buzzed with yet another call from a business associate, no doubt wanting to discuss the shocking developments at Huxley Financial. Leonard let it go to voicemail, as he had with the dozens of other calls that morning. The business world moved fast when blood was in the water. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in." Ivy entered, looking concerned and slightly out of place in the opulent surroundings. She was carrying Lila, who immediately perked up when she saw Leonard. "Penman!" Lila called out happily, reaching toward him. Leonard stood and took his daughter into his arms, breathing in her familiar scent of baby shampoo and innocence. At least this part of his world remained unchanged. "Patricia told me what happened when I called," Ivy said quietly. "About the company, your father. Leonard, I'm so sorry." "Don't be. I made my choice." Leonard settled into his chair with Lila on his lap, watching as she immediately reached for the colorful blocks he'd bought for her visits. "But your entire life, your career, my career was built on my father's foundation, with his rules, his priorities." Leonard helped Lila stack a blue block on top of a red one. "Maybe it's time I figured out what I actually want to build." Ivy studied his face carefully. "You say that now, but when the reality sets in, when you realize what you've lost—" "What have I lost, Ivy?" Leonard interrupted gently. "Money. I have enough saved to live comfortably for several lifetimes. Status? I never cared about impressing strangers. Power? The only power that matters to me now is the power to be present for my daughter." As if summoned by his words, Lila looked up at him with her bright eyes. "Daddy," she said clearly, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. Leonard's breath caught. It was the first time she'd called him anything other than Penman. Ivy's hand flew to her mouth, her own eyes filling with tears. "Did she just—" Leonard's voice was thick with emotion. "Daddy," Lila repeated, apparently pleased with the reaction she'd gotten. She patted Leonard's cheek with her small hand. "My daddy." Leonard felt his composure crumble completely. All the meetings he'd missed, all the money his father was threatening to take away, all the professional bridges that were burning around him, None of it mattered compared to this moment. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered, kissing the top of her head. "I'm your daddy." Ivy sat down heavily in the chair across from them, wiping at her eyes. She's been practicing that word for days. I think she was waiting for the right moment. "She has perfect timing," Leonard said, his voice still shaky. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Lila play with her blocks and chatter to herself in the special language that only toddlers understood. The November afternoon light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden patterns across the room. "Leonard," Ivy said eventually, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" "Anything. Why now? Why was standing up to your father worth losing everything for? A year ago you chose the company over us. What changed?" Leonard considered the question seriously, watching Lila attempt to balance 3 blocks in an increasingly precarious tower. "A year ago I thought love was a luxury I couldn't afford. I thought being a good provider meant being absent, being focused solely on building wealth and power. I thought that's what it meant to be a man, because that's what my father taught me." Lila's tower tumbled and she clapped her hands with delight rather than frustration, immediately starting to rebuild it. "But watching her," Leonard continued, "seeing how she approaches the world with such joy and resilience, how she loves unconditionally, she's teaching me what strength actually looks like. And you," he looked directly at Ivy, "you've been strong enough to build a life for both of you without me. Strong enough to protect her from my mistakes. Strong enough to give me a second chance I didn't deserve." "I wasn't feeling very strong," Ivy admitted, "especially that night in the hospital. I was terrified and exhausted and completely out of my depth. But you called me. Despite everything I'd done, you trusted me enough to call when you needed help. That meant everything to me, Ivy." Before Ivy could respond, Leonard's phone rang again. This time he glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It was his lawyer, Marcus Brennan, and Leonard had been expecting this call. "I should take this," he said, gently transferring Lila to Ivy's lap. "Marcus, what's the verdict?" "It's not good, Leonard. Your father has convinced the board that you're having some kind of breakdown. They're moving to have you declared mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs, let alone the company. If this goes through, you could lose access to most of your personal assets as well." Leonard felt the walls closing in around him, but strangely, he felt more at peace than he had in years. "How long do I have?" "The hearing is Monday." "Leonard, I have to ask. Are you prepared for the possibility that you might lose everything? Your inheritance, your trust funds, even your penthouse could be at risk if they successfully argue that you're not competent to manage your own financial affairs." Leonard looked at Ivy holding Lila, both of them watching him with concern and trust in their eyes. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me. I want to set up a trust fund for Lila, something my father can't touch no matter what happens to me. Use whatever liquid assets I have access to right now." "Leonard, that's a significant amount of money. Are you sure you want to?" "I'm sure. And Marcus, if I lose everything else, I need you to help me figure out how to rebuild from scratch, because I'm not going anywhere. I'm not abandoning my family again." When he hung up, Ivy was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You could fight this," she said quietly. "Reconcile with your father, go back to the way things were. You don't have to lose everything for us." Leonard knelt in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Ivy, don't you understand? I already lost everything once when I lost you and Lila. Everything else is just money and buildings and titles. This," he gestured to include all 3 of them, "this is everything that actually matters." Lila, sensing the serious mood, crawled from Ivy's lap into Leonard's arms. "Daddy sad?" "No, baby girl," Leonard said, holding her close. "Daddy's not sad. Daddy's exactly where he's supposed to be." As the afternoon sun began to set over Manhattan, Leonard realized that for the first time in his adult life he was completely certain about his future, even if that future was about to become far more uncertain than he'd ever imagined. The mahogany-paneled conference room at Brennan & Associates felt like a courtroom, as Leonard sat across from his father and 3 board members who had once considered him their golden boy. The Monday morning hearing to determine his mental competency had drawn a crowd of lawyers, executives, and financial analysts, all eager to witness the spectacular fall of the Huxley heir. Leonard wore his best charcoal suit, his appearance impeccable despite the circumstances, but his hands folded calmly on the polished table told a different story. Gone was the aggressive confidence that had once made him a feared negotiator. In its place was a quiet certainty that unnerved everyone in the room. Richard Huxley sat at the opposite end of the conference table like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his pale eyes cold with determination. Beside him sat Dr. Harrison Wells, a psychiatrist Leonard had never met, but who apparently had strong opinions about his mental state based on observable behavioral patterns. "Mr. Leonard Huxley," began Judge Patricia Hawthorne, a stern woman in her 60s who specialized in financial competency cases. "These proceedings have been initiated due to concerns about your recent decision-making capabilities. Your father and the board of Huxley Financial have presented evidence suggesting you are not mentally fit to manage your personal or professional affairs." Leonard's lawyer, Marcus Brennan, leaned forward. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to demonstrate his complete mental competency and sound judgment." Dr. Wells cleared his throat. "With respect, Your Honor, Mr. Huxley's recent behavior speaks for itself. He has abandoned crucial business opportunities worth billions of dollars. He has chosen to prioritize a relationship with a child he previously abandoned and an ex-wife who clearly married him for financial gain. These are not the actions of a rational man." "Objection," Marcus said firmly. "Dr. Wells has never examined my client, and his characterization of Mr. Huxley's family relationships is both inappropriate and inaccurate." Judge Hawthorne raised her hand for silence. "Mr. Huxley, I'd like to hear from you directly. Can you explain your recent choices, particularly your decision to risk your entire inheritance for what your father describes as misplaced sentimentality?" Leonard stood slowly, his gray eyes meeting his father's across the room. "Your Honor, my father taught me that success was measured by the size of your bank account and the fear you could inspire in your competitors. For 38 years, I believed him. I built my life around accumulating wealth and power, and I convinced myself that everything else was weakness." He paused, thinking of Lila's small hand in his at the hospital, of her bright smile when she called him Daddy for the first time. 2 months ago, I saw my daughter in the rain, cold and vulnerable, and I realized that all the money in the world meant nothing if I had no one to share it with. I had achieved everything my father wanted for me, and I was completely empty inside. Richard's face darkened with fury. "Leonard, this emotional display is exactly what we're concerned about. You're making decisions based on feelings rather than logic." "I'm making decisions based on love," Leonard interrupted, his voice strong and clear. "Something you taught me to fear, but something I've learned is actually the most logical choice of all." Dr. Wells shuffled his papers importantly. "Your Honor, this confirms our assessment. Mr. Huxley is exhibiting classic signs of a midlife crisis combined with guilt-induced decision-making. His attachment to this child and her mother is clearly a psychological compensation for years of neglect." "With all due respect, Dr. Wells," Leonard said calmly, "you've never spoken to my daughter. You've never seen how she lights up when she solves a puzzle, or how she comforts her stuffed elephant when it falls down, or how she's learned to stack blocks higher than her own head through pure determination. If wanting to be present for those moments makes me incompetent, then I question your definition of mental health." Judge Hawthorne made a note on her papers. "Mr. Huxley, your father has provided evidence that you've missed crucial business meetings, turned down profitable deals, and essentially abandoned your responsibilities to the company. How do you respond to these allegations?" "They're absolutely true," Leonard replied without hesitation. "I missed those meetings because my daughter was in the hospital with a fever that wouldn't break. I turned down those deals because they would have required me to travel extensively and miss more time with her. I abandoned those responsibilities because I finally understood that my greatest responsibility was to be the father she deserves." The room was silent for a moment. Even Richard seemed taken aback by Leonard's complete honesty. Marcus stood and placed a folder in front of Judge Hawthorne. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit evidence of Mr. Huxley's recent financial decisions. He has successfully transferred significant assets into a protected trust fund for his daughter, demonstrating both forward thinking and sound fiscal judgment. He has also been exploring new business ventures that would allow him more flexibility while maintaining financial stability." "What kind of ventures?" Judge Hawthorne asked. Leonard smiled slightly. "I've been consulting with smaller companies, helping them with strategic planning and investment guidance. The work is challenging and profitable, but it allows me to set my own schedule. I've also been considering teaching, sharing the business knowledge I've gained with graduate students." Dr. Wells scoffed. "From CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation to part-time consultant and teacher, this is hardly evidence of sound judgment. It's evidence of a man who has learned what actually matters," Leonard replied. Doctor Wells, have you ever held your child while they recovered from illness? Have you ever watched them take their first steps or heard them say, "I love you" for the first time? That's irrelevant to. It's completely relevant, because those experiences have taught me more about leadership, patience, and strength than 30 years in boardrooms ever did. My daughter has shown me what real courage looks like. The courage to love unconditionally, to try again after failure, to choose joy even when things are difficult. Richard stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking. This is exactly the kind of sentimental nonsense we're talking about. Leonard, you're throwing away everything I built, everything our family stands for. Leonard turned to face his father directly. Dad, what does our family stand for? Because if it's just money and power and emotional isolation, then maybe it's time for a new foundation. Your Honor, Marcus interjected, we request that you consider not just my client's recent choices, but the reasoning behind them and the positive outcomes they've produced. Mr. Huxley has reconnected with his daughter, established a stable financial plan for her future, and found meaningful work that utilizes his skills while allowing him to be present for his family. These are the actions of a competent, thoughtful individual, not someone who is mentally unstable. Judge Hawthorne looked around the room, her expression thoughtful. I'm going to recess for 30 minutes to review all the evidence and testimony. When we return, I'll render my decision. As the room emptied, Leonard remained seated, feeling oddly peaceful despite everything hanging in the balance. Win or lose, he knew he had spoken his truth. For the first time in his life, he had stood up not just to his father, but to the entire system that had shaped him into someone he didn't want to be anymore. Marcus placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. Whatever happens, Leonard, you should be proud of how you handled yourself in there. Leonard thought of Ivy and Lila, probably at the playground right now, living their lives and trusting him to find his way back to them. That trust was worth more than any inheritance or corporate title ever could be. In 30 minutes, he would learn whether the law agreed with him. The 30-minute recess felt like hours. Leonard stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law firm, watching the bustling streets of Manhattan below. People hurried past in their everyday lives, completely unaware that his entire future was being decided in a mahogany-paneled room just floors above them. Marcus approached with 2 cups of coffee, his expression carefully neutral. "How are you holding up?" "Strangely calm," Leonard admitted, accepting the coffee. "I keep thinking about Lila. She fell off her little bike last week at the park and scraped her knee pretty badly. She cried for about 30 seconds, then got right back on and kept riding. If she can be that brave at 18 months old, I can handle whatever happens in there." "Leonard," Marcus said quietly, "you know there's still time to make a deal with your father. Apologize, promise to refocus on the business, maybe arrange limited visitation with Lila. You could keep most of your inheritance." Leonard looked at his longtime friend and lawyer. "Marcus, would you give up your children for money?" "Of course not, but then you understand why that's not an option for me." The bailiff appeared in the doorway. "Judge Hawthorne is ready to reconvene." Back in the conference room, the tension was palpable. Richard sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched with anticipation. Dr. Wells shuffled through his papers one final time. Leonard took his seat and folded his hands calmly, drawing strength from the mental image of Ivy and Lila waiting for him at home. Judge Hawthorne entered and took her place at the head of the table. "After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, I'm prepared to render my decision regarding the mental competency of Leonard James Huxley." The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. "Mr. Huxley," Judge Hawthorne began, "your recent choices may be unconventional by traditional business standards, but they demonstrate clear, rational thinking, forward planning, and prioritization of values that are, frankly, admirable. The evidence shows that you have made thoughtful financial arrangements for your daughter's future, pursued alternative career paths that utilize your skills, and maintained your ability to make sound decisions under pressure." Leonard felt his chest loosen slightly, but he remained focused on the judge's words. "Furthermore," she continued, "the testimony regarding your relationship with your daughter demonstrates emotional growth and maturity, not instability. A man who chooses to be present for his child's medical emergency over a business meeting is showing exactly the kind of judgment we should hope to see from responsible parents." Richard's face was growing redder by the moment, but he remained silent. "Therefore, I find Leonard James Huxley to be mentally competent and fully capable of managing his personal and professional affairs. This petition is denied." The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Leonard's entire body. He had won. He was free to make his own choices. to build the life he wanted with Ivy and Lila. But before he could fully process the relief, Richard stood abruptly, his face twisted with rage, and something that looked almost like desperation. "This is a mistake," Richard said, his voice shaking with fury. "Leonard, you have no idea what you're throwing away. You think that woman loves you? You think she'll stay when the money runs out?" "Dad, enough. She came to see me," Richard interrupted, his words dropping like bombs into the suddenly quiet room. "3 weeks ago, your precious Ivy came to my office." Leonard felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you talking about?" Richard's smile was cruel and triumphant. "She wanted to make a deal. Said she'd disappear with the child if I paid her $5 million. She claimed she was protecting you from having to choose between your family and your inheritance. But we both know what she really wanted." The words hit Leonard like physical blows. Around the room he could see the expressions of shock and vindication on the board members' faces. Dr. Wells was nodding as if this proved all his theories about Leonard's impaired judgment. "You're lying," Leonard said, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "Ask her yourself," Richard replied smoothly. "Ask your loving ex-wife why she came to my office with her hand out, ready to sell her own daughter's relationship with her father for the right price." Leonard's mind reeled. Could it be true? Had Ivy been planning to take Lila away all along? Had every moment of progress, every gentle smile, every shared worry over their daughter been part of some elaborate manipulation? "The offer is still open, Leonard," Richard continued, pressing his advantage. "Come back to the family business. Forget this nonsense about love and fatherhood, and we can make sure that gold-digging ex-wife of yours never bothers you again." Leonard stood slowly, his legs feeling unsteady. "I need to go." "Leonard, wait," Marcus called out, but Leonard was already heading for the door. The elevator ride down felt endless. Leonard's mind was spinning with images. Ivy in the hospital, exhausted and vulnerable, calling him for help. Ivy letting him read to Lila, trusting him to be gentle with their daughter's heart. Ivy crying with relief when Lila's fever broke. Had it all been an act? Had she been planning to disappear with Lila while he was falling in love with being a father? By the time Leonard reached his car, his hands were shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The drive to Ivy's brownstone passed in a blur of red lights and honking horns. Leonard parked haphazardly and took the front steps 2 at a time, his heart pounding with a combination of anger and desperate hope that his father was lying. He knocked on the door harder than necessary, his entire body tense with the need to know the truth. When Ivy opened the door, she was smiling, clearly expecting a normal visit. "Leonard, you're early. How did the hearing go?" "I was just making lunch and—" "Did you go see my father?" Leonard interrupted, his voice harsh and unfamiliar. Ivy's smile faltered immediately. "What? Did you go to his office 3 weeks ago? Did you ask him for money to disappear with Lila?" The color drained from Ivy's face, and Leonard felt his heart shatter into pieces. Her expression told him everything he needed to know even before she spoke. "Leonard, I can explain. So it's true." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You were planning to take her away." From inside the apartment came the sound of Lila's laughter, completely oblivious to the fact that her world was about to change forever. Leonard looked at the woman he had been falling in love with all over again, the woman he had chosen over his entire inheritance, and realized he didn't know her at all. Leonard stood in Ivy's doorway, his gray eyes filled with a pain so raw it made her take a step backward. Behind him, the November afternoon had turned cold and gray, matching the sudden chill that had descended between them. "Leonard, please, let me explain what really happened," Ivy said, her voice trembling with urgency. "What's to explain?" Leonard's words came out sharp and bitter. "You went to my father behind my back. You asked for money. You were planning to disappear with my daughter." "That's not—" Ivy started, but Leonard held up his hand. Don't lie to me anymore. I can see it in your face, Ivy. You did go see him." From the living room, Lila's voice called out happily, "Daddy! Daddy home!" The sound of his daughter's joy cut through Leonard like a knife. How could he explain to an 18-month-old that her world was about to be torn apart again? How could he tell her that the trust he'd been building with her mother was built on lies? Ivy's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, I went to see your father, but not for the reasons you think." "Leonard, please come inside. Let me tell you what actually happened." "I don't want to hear your excuses." "They're not excuses." Ivy's voice rose with desperation. 3 weeks ago, after you chose us over your inheritance, I was terrified. Not because I wanted your money, but because I was afraid you'd regret it. I was afraid you'd wake up one day and resent us for costing you everything. Leonard's jaw tightened. So you decided to make the choice for me? I went to your father's office to try to find a way to give you back what you'd lost without losing you again. Ivy's tears were flowing freely now. I thought maybe if I could convince him that you were just going through a phase, that if he waited and was patient, you'd come back to the business on your own terms. By offering to take Lila away from me? No. Ivy's voice cracked with emotion. I told him I'd refuse any visitation or support if he would just give you time to figure out how to balance both worlds. I thought maybe there was a way for you to have your family and your inheritance. Leonard stared at her, his mind reeling. That doesn't make sense. He said you asked for $5 million. Ivy's face crumpled. He offered me the money. When I told him I'd step back to give you space to reconcile with him, he assumed I was looking for a payoff. He pulled out his checkbook and started writing, saying that $5 million should be enough to disappear permanently and keep the child quiet about her paternity. And what did you say? I told him he could keep his money and go to hell. Ivy's voice was fierce despite her tears. I told him that you were worth more than all his billions, and that Lila deserved to know her father regardless of how much money he had. Then I walked out. Leonard felt his world shifting again, but he couldn't let himself hope. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? Because I was ashamed, Ivy whispered. I was ashamed that I'd doubted your choice, that I'd gone behind your back trying to fix something that wasn't broken. I was ashamed that for even a moment I'd considered that maybe you'd be better off without us. Lila appeared in the hallway then, dragging Button behind her and looking confused by the tension she could sense but not understand. Mama crying? Daddy sad? Leonard knelt down automatically as Lila toddled toward him, his heart breaking as she wrapped her small arms around his neck with complete trust and love. Why everyone sad? Lila asked, patting Leonard's cheek with her tiny hand. Leonard looked up at Ivy, who was watching them with an expression of such raw love and fear that it took his breath away. Mama's sad because she thought she might have to say goodbye to Daddy. No bye-bye, Lila said firmly, tightening her grip on Leonard's neck. Daddy stay. I want to stay, sweetheart, Leonard said softly. But Daddy needs to talk to Mama about some grown-up things. Leonard stood, still holding Lila, and looked directly at Ivy. I need you to be completely honest with me. Was any part of you relieved when he offered that money? Did you ever think it might be easier to just take it and walk away? Ivy met his gaze steadily. For about 10 seconds, yes. Not because I wanted the money, but because loving you has been the hardest thing I've ever done. Watching you choose work over family, signing those divorce papers, raising Lila alone while wondering if you'd ever want to know her. It nearly broke me. She took a shaky breath. But then I thought about her first steps, which you missed. Her first words, which you didn't hear. All the nights I've watched her sleep and seen your eyes looking back at me, and I realized that no amount of money could replace what she'd lose if she never really knew her father. Leonard felt his anger dissolving, replaced by a deeper understanding of the impossible position Ivy had been in. Why didn't you just ask me how I was feeling about my choice? Because you seemed so certain, so at peace with it. I didn't want to plant seeds of doubt. Ivy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I was trying to protect you from having to choose again. Ivy, Leonard said gently, shifting Lila to one arm so he could reach out to touch Ivy's face. The choice was never hard once I understood what I was choosing between. I wasn't choosing between money and family, I was choosing between living my father's life or living my own. But your inheritance, your company, will still be there if I ever want to fight for them. But Lila's childhood, these moments with her, your trust, those things I can never get back if I lose them. Lila, sensing that the mood was improving, began babbling happily and reaching for her mother. Ivy stepped closer, and suddenly they were standing in a small circle, their daughter connecting them physically just as she had emotionally. I should have told you about meeting with your father, Ivy said quietly. I should have trusted you enough to share my fears instead of trying to solve everything myself. And I should have told you how scared I was that I'd mess this up, that I'd somehow hurt you and Lila again without meaning to. Leonard's voice was soft but certain. But Ivy, we can't keep making decisions for each other out of fear. If we're going to do this, if we're going to be a family, we have to trust each other with the truth, even when it's complicated. Lila chose that moment to lean over and give Ivy a wet, enthusiastic kiss on the cheek, then do the same to Leonard. Love Mama. Love Daddy. Yes, baby girl, Leonard said, his voice thick with emotion. Love Mama and Daddy. Ivy looked up at him with hope and uncertainty warring in her green eyes. So what happens now? Where do we go from here? Leonard thought about his father's manipulation, about the choice between his old life and his new one, about all the challenges that still lay ahead of them. Then he looked at his daughter, who was playing with his tie and humming softly to herself, completely secure in her little world. "Now we figure it out together," he said simply. "All of it. My career, our relationship, how to give Lila the life she deserves. But we do it honestly, as partners, not as people trying to protect each other from difficult truths. Even if it's messy and complicated?" "Especially if it's messy and complicated," Leonard replied with a small smile. "I've learned that the best things in life usually are." As the gray afternoon light filtered through Ivy's living room windows, Leonard realized that he had finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing it. A home that was built on love rather than fear, trust rather than control, and the beautiful, terrifying vulnerability of letting people matter more than anything else in the world. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed through the large windows of the cozy house in Westchester, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors where 3-year-old Lila was building an elaborate castle with her blocks. Her dark hair had grown into soft curls that bounced as she moved, and her gray eyes, so much like her father's, sparkled with concentration and joy. "Daddy, look, Princess Castle," she announced proudly, pointing to her colorful creation. Leonard looked up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing notes for his afternoon lecture at Columbia Business School. His home office was a far cry from the sterile corporate environment he'd once commanded. Warm, lived in, with family photos scattered among business books and a small corner dedicated to Lila's art projects. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, closing the laptop and giving her his full attention. "Tell me about the princess who lives there." "She has a daddy who reads her stories and a mama who makes pancakes," Lila said matter-of-factly, adding another block to her tower. "And she has a baby brother who cries sometimes, but he's very nice." Leonard's heart swelled as he watched his daughter unconsciously describe their own family. 6 months ago, Ivy had given birth to their son, James, and watching Lila embrace her role as big sister had been one of the most beautiful experiences of Leonard's life. "Where is your mama this morning?" Leonard asked, though he already knew the answer. "Feeding baby James," Lila replied, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "He's very hungry all the time." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Ivy's arrival. She appeared in the doorway holding 6-month-old James, who had inherited his mother's blonde hair and gentle disposition. Ivy looked radiant in her simple blue dress, her hair longer now and often adorned with whatever colorful hair tie Lila had chosen for her that morning. "Good morning, my loves," Ivy said, settling into the comfortable armchair near Leonard's desk. James immediately reached for his father, making the soft cooing sounds that never failed to melt Leonard's heart. Leonard took his son carefully, marveling as he always did at how natural fatherhood had become. "How did he sleep?" "Better than last week. I think he's finally adjusting to his schedule." Ivy smiled as she watched Leonard expertly support James's head and make silly faces that sent the baby into delighted giggles. The past 2 years had been a journey of rebuilding and rediscovering. Leonard's consulting firm, Huxley Strategic Partners, had grown steadily as word spread about his innovative approach to business ethics and work-life balance. His classes at Columbia were consistently overbooked, filled with young executives eager to learn how to achieve success without sacrificing their humanity. The financial cushion from his trust fund had allowed them to buy this house, not as grand as his former penthouse, but infinitely more valuable because it was filled with laughter, love, and the beautiful chaos of family life. "Daddy, play blocks?" Lila asked, tugging on his sleeve. "In just a minute, princess. Daddy needs to tell Mama something first." Leonard looked at Ivy with the same wonder he'd felt on the day she'd agreed to marry him again. A simple ceremony in their backyard 6 months before James was born, with Lila as their flower girl and only their closest friends as witnesses. "Richard called this morning," Leonard said quietly. Ivy's expression immediately became guarded. Leonard's father had made several attempts at reconciliation over the past 2 years, each one ending in disappointment when it became clear he still expected Leonard to choose business over family. What did he want this time? "To meet James," Leonard replied, his own feelings mixed. "And to apologize to you, apparently. He said he's been thinking about what I told him the last time we spoke, about how empty his life has become without family. What do you think?" Leonard looked at his son, who was gripping his finger with surprising strength, then at Lila, who was patiently waiting for him to join her game, and finally at Ivy, who had supported every difficult decision he'd made in rebuilding his life. I think forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting, he said carefully. I'm willing to let him try to be a grandfather, but only if he can respect the boundaries we set and the life we've built. Ivy nodded slowly. Any relationship he has with our children goes through us first. Absolutely. Leonard shifted James to one arm and reached for Ivy's hand with the other. I learned a long time ago that protecting this family is more important than maintaining peace with people who don't respect what we've chosen. Lila had grown tired of waiting and climbed onto Leonard's lap, careful not to disturb her baby brother. Daddy, story time. What story would you like today, princess? The one about the elephant who learned to be brave. Leonard smiled, recognizing her request for a story he'd made up about a little elephant who had to choose between staying safe in the zoo or venturing into the wild to find her family. It had become Lila's favorite, though Leonard suspected she didn't fully understand that it was really his own story, told through the lens of childhood wonder. As he began the familiar tale, with Ivy curled up beside them and James contentedly watching the ceiling fan spin, Leonard reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The corporate world he'd left behind seemed like a different lifetime, important in its own way but ultimately hollow compared to the richness of the life he'd built with his family. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, his former lawyer and now close friend, reminding him about the charity auction they were attending that evening. Leonard and Ivy had become advocates for single-parent support programs, using their story to help other families navigate the challenges of separation and reconciliation. What are you thinking about? Ivy asked softly, noting the contemplative expression on his face. Just all of this. Leonard gestured to encompass their cozy morning scene. 2 years ago, I thought success meant commanding a boardroom and striking fear into competitors. Now I know it means having my 3-year-old daughter insist I read her the same story every morning, and having my 6-month-old son smile when he sees my face, and having a wife who still gets butterflies when you walk in the room, Ivy added with a gentle smile. Especially that, Leonard agreed, leaning over to kiss her forehead. Lila finished the story along with him, having memorized every word, then slid off his lap to return to her blocks. Now play castle, Daddy? Absolutely, princess. As Leonard settled onto the floor beside his daughter, with Ivy and James nearby, he thought about all the different definitions of wealth he'd learned throughout his life. There was his father's version, measured in dollars and power and the ability to control others. There was society's version, status and possessions and the envious looks of strangers. But here, in this sun-filled room with his family around him, Leonard had discovered the only wealth that truly mattered, the kind that grew when you shared it, that multiplied when you gave it away, and that could never be taken from you by market crashes or corporate coups or family disapproval. Leonard, Ivy said suddenly, do you ever regret it? Everything you gave up to have this? Leonard looked at his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in rebuilding not just their family but himself, and realized the question contained its own answer. Ivy, I didn't give up anything, he said with absolute certainty. I finally figured out what was worth keeping. As James dozed in his mother's arms and Lila chattered about her castle's many rooms, Leonard understood that some stories don't end with dramatic declarations or grand gestures. Sometimes the best stories end with quiet Sunday mornings, with the sound of children playing, with the simple peace of knowing you're exactly where you belong. Outside, the world continued its relentless pace of ambition and competition, but inside this house in Westchester, time moved at the rhythm of family life, slower, gentler, and infinitely more precious than anything Leonard had ever known before. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding someone new but about rediscovering who you were meant to be all along. When faced with the choice between the life you've built and the family you've lost, which would you choose? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.